Hello. I'm so sorry. Hey everybody, and welcome to my review of the season finale of The Mandalorian, as well as last week's episode. I decided to do another 2-for-1. We just saw the end of season 2, and let's just go ahead and do the blanket spoiler alert, because as with most episodes this season, there's really not much non-spoiler talk to be had, so please beware, because I can't even really give general impressions about this episode without going into spoilers. If you've heard about the episode or you've seen the episode, I'm sure you probably know why. So let's just go straight into spoilers. As you can see, I'm still on board with the show because I've gone full Mandalorian today. I'm not off board with the show, but let's talk about this season finale. Last week's episode, I think, was a pretty solid setup. I thought it was a really good action episode. You have another example of the helmet being removed. We got to see Pedro Pascal's face last week as well as this week in a very touching and affecting scene amongst many other scenes in the season finale. And I really liked last week's episode. I didn't quite like it enough to justify its own standalone review. I think it brought up some very interesting things. I loved how they returned to this character of Miggs and make him sort of challenge the Mandalorian's worldview and say, well, you see things in such black and white, you never know how the world and how the galaxy works and how you have to compromise your principles. And we see this later on with the removal of the helmet and allowing someone else to see his face, which is a big no-no in the Mandalorian's culture, at least the version that he adheres to. And then, of course, we ended last week's episode with his Liam Neeson and Taken moment, basically calling his shot to Moff Gideon, saying, you've got something I love. You have no idea what's headed your way. It was a great way to set up this week's episode 8 of Season 2 of The Mandalorian, entitled The Rescue, where we see the rescue operation put together to save young Grogu here from the clutches of Moff Gideon. One of the biggest challenges we see for everybody, but particularly the Mandalorian in this episode, are the Dark Troopers, which are confirmed as third-generation Dark Trooper armor with droid technology. No longer humans inside, they are droids, and they are formidable foes. As a matter of fact, this is maybe the hardest we've ever seen the Mandalorian fight any enemy, and it's not even a human being, a Mandalorian, you name it. And I really like this one-on-one fight. It does set up Dark Troopers. If you're fighting a platoon of them, as was certainly almost the case at the end of this episode, you're either going to have a Jedi or some really, really, really good people fighting, because the one-on-one fight was kind of a toss-up between one Dark Trooper and one Mandalorian. So you've really set these droids up as very formidable foes going into later seasons of the show. I liked this showdown between the two because, so many of the Mandalorian's usual tricks didn't work against this enemy, and he had to use the Beskar spear. He had to use his brains and his brawn and eventually vent all of the other ones out into space. It's very convenient that you keep the Dark Troopers in a room that has a big door that opens out into space. A little bit convenient as well that it took them so long to jetpack their way back to the ship, but you just got to grant those things or you're going to drive yourself crazy. Believe me, there's plenty of other things in the episode that we'll get to that I had a little bit more of a problem with. So I'm going to hand wave that stuff away because I can. Eventually, we get the fight that we've been building up to all season, the one-on-one showdown between the Mandalorian and Moff Gideon, and you knew this was going to go down the second that cell door opened and you saw Moff Gideon wielding that darksaber over Grogu's head. Nope, you knew this fight was coming, and again, you have a great matchup of two different weapons. The fact that the darksaber cannot cut through pure Beskar, and you happen to have an opponent whose armor and spear are made of pure Beskar, made for a really good fight. I do feel like because you had two physical fights in a row, one against the Dark Troopers, one against Moff Gideon, that you had a cool weapon in the darksaber, but I don't think that the physical fight was that formidable, because once Moff Gideon is disarmed of the darksaber, he's really no threat to the Mandalorian. And of course, you can't kill Moff Gideon because he still has to deliver some very important exposition, which is that the darksaber cannot just be taken. It must be won in battle, and it cannot be willfully surrendered. And so now we've set up a conflict potentially going forward where obviously Bo-Katan very much wants this darksaber. It is currently bonded to or belongs to the Mandalorian and can only be won from him and legitimately wielded by Bo-Katan if she wins it off of him through some sort of combat. Are we going to see a fight between these two? We've already seen that he cannot willingly give it to her, so that's going to be something going forward into season 3 potentially, because Bo-Katan wants to go back to Mandalore. She wants to take the throne, but she can't do that until she wields the darksaber, and she can't wield the darksaber until she wins it off the Mandalorian. We could go on about darksaber lore all day, but as it turns out, the group had an even bigger problem because, as I mentioned before, after a little while floating in space, the Dark Troopers jet their way back to the light cruiser and are now going to attack the bridge en masse. And as Moff Gideon points out pretty accurately, it would have been one hell of a last stand, but ultimately we would have had a lot of dead Mandalorians and one Moff and one child, pretty much where we started off, except no characters for any spinoffs or a main character for the show next season. Obviously, that wasn't going to happen, and rescue was on its way. As a matter of fact, we saw one lone X-Wing flying in, and maybe I'm a little dense because I talked about the fact that a couple weeks ago when we saw Slave One fly in, I was just like, oh, Boba Fett. I mean, immediately my mind jumped to Boba Fett. When I saw that one lone X-Wing come in, I was still going like, oh, gee, I wonder who that could be. I think because I never honestly in my mind entertained the concept, and get ready for the biggest spoiler of all, that they would or could actually bring Luke Skywalker in any way into the show. Now, obviously, where it is in the timeline, you could definitely do that because we know that Luke is very much alive. He's training Jedi. But because of the fact that we've learned so much about what happened after Return of the Jedi in the last series of movies, I honestly narratively didn't think that they would put Grogu with Luke because knowing what we know, there's only a few possibilities about what's going on with Grogu after this. Number one, he trains with Luke, he stays as a student with Luke, and he literally burned to death in a fire, which I don't think would be a great ending for Grogu, and honestly, I think there might be a little bit of a revolt. I guess there is one possibility, which is that Disney is really committed to the whole Kylo Ren kill the past, burn it down if you have to thing with the sequel trilogy by unintentionally, unbeknownst to J.J. Abrams or Rian Johnson, making it so that they killed Grogu in a fire. That's not nice to either one of them. Now, I've got my problems with both of their films, but let's not make them Grogu killers after the fact. So I hope that that's a possibility that we can throw away. Let's say Grogu escaped the burning to death in a fire with Luke Skywalker's other students' fates. Then the question becomes, does he not become a Jedi? Does he not complete his training? Where does he go? Maybe we're going to find this out in later seasons of the show, but my issues narratively, again, I have a couple with this Luke Skywalker thing, and listen, I've seen the reaction already, even though it just aired an hour ago, and most people are losing their ever-loving minds over this, and I wish I could be doing the same thing. I really do, because, this is the Return of the Jedi Luke Skywalker, like, original trilogy Luke Skywalker. But even when I saw that green lightsaber, even when he was coming through and he came in on the X-Wing and you see the gloved hand and everything with the hood and everything, when he walks onto the bridge, there was part of me that was kind of hoping that he would pull that hood back and that it wouldn't be Luke Skywalker. First of all, and look, I know that people love the character of Luke Skywalker, but I've got to be honest, it didn't look good. It looked like a bad computer effect, and it didn't sound like Luke at all. So that kind of put me off in general. If they'd been able to kind of cut him out of Return of the Jedi and use actual Mark Hamill footage from that time so it looked a little more realistic, and I don't demand photorealism, but it just didn't look ready. I almost would have preferred that they bring in somebody or not show his face than what we got. So the look of it, I wasn't really crazy about. The Luke Skywalker action was cool, but I thought it was a bit of a repeat beat of the Boba Fett reveal. The ship flies in, you see him come in, he fights everybody, and honestly, it was a little similar to what they did with Darth Vader back in Rogue One, where he ignites the lightsaber and we have this hallway fight and you see him cutting through people, and I was a big fan of that. And it was cool to see Luke doing all this stuff because we've never really seen him as a Jedi do this, but I think what it comes down to in my brain and where I have the biggest problem is that, and I've said it every time I've talked about The Mandalorian, is like, why do you like The Mandalorian? What is it about the show that you love? And I've always said it's because it takes us to these corners of the galaxy that we've never seen before. things that we don't know. Even when you're bringing in characters like Bo-Katan and Ahsoka Tano, right now the narrative isn't driven by that. It's driven by the story of Grogu and the story of the Mandalorian and their adventures and where they go. And we're seeing little places and things that we haven't seen before. Yes, there's obviously overlap with the Empire, etc., but it's its own story in its own little corners of the galaxy. And yet, here with Grogu, we now have a line that is tied directly back to Luke Skywalker. I don't want to go back to Luke Skywalker. We just wrapped up 9 movies that all tied up right back to Luke Skywalker. You include Rogue One and Solo. I mean, those also all eventually went back to the Skywalker saga. What I loved about The Mandalorian is that we were finally getting away from all that. There was no Luke. We were doing completely different things. And now in this season finale, here we are right back again at Luke Skywalker. And I'm happy that people were happy to see him, but in my brain too, it's like if we hadn't seen Luke Skywalker, if the sequel trilogy had never happened, then I think maybe I would be a little more excited too. But it's like I saw Luke Skywalker last year. He was in the movie. He was in Rise of Skywalker. He was right there, and I saw him 2 years before that. It's not like we haven't seen Luke in many, many years. I know what happened to him. I know where he goes. I know what happened in between this and Force Awakens and Last Jedi. I know that this training that he's taking Grogu to is going to end terribly. And so all of the mystery about what's going to happen is kind of gone. Now Grogu's story is down to, is he going to stay with Luke or is he somehow going to leave Luke? So you've boxed in a little bit, in my mind, narratively, where you're going to go with Grogu. And instead of this open-ended galaxy that we've had in front of us, we've now started drawing boxes and squares around our characters by putting them in the timeline of characters that already have established narratives. I'm happy for everybody that loved that Luke was in this episode. And I'm not invalidating your joy, and I'm not trying to poo-poo on your parade or say that you're wrong. If you loved the ever-loving snot out of this Luke Skywalker scene, I'm very happy for you. And I sat there and I really did. I really tried so hard to kind of quell this voice in my head, but ultimately this was the outcome that I least wanted for all of this, for all of the Jedi stuff and for Grogu reaching out. And every time somebody would ask me, and I've done a few shows when we talk about The Mandalorian and they say, well, Grogu reaching out to a Jedi, who's it? Do you think it's Luke Skywalker? Every time I've said, gosh, I hope not. I think it might come down to what is the most appealing about this show for different groups of people, and everybody looks for different things in The Mandalorian. For me, what I've always loved is when it surprises me, when it takes me somewhere new, when it takes me somewhere different. I was very skeptical of Boba Fett even returning. I eventually did like the way that they did his storyline because even though he is a returning character, you don't know what happened to him. So there is a story to explore, which we'll talk about in a second. But the difference here with Luke is it feels like the franchise going backwards. And I think it's almost making some of the same mistakes that the franchise in general has made before, which is relying a little too heavily on nostalgia, a little too heavily on the things that people are familiar with. When you look at what The Mandalorian has done so successfully is they're creating new iconic Star Wars imagery. We've brought in these legacy characters, which I think has worked so far for the storyline, but we've now directly tied the most popular character on the show, sorry Mando, directly to Luke Skywalker. And I just don't know if it's the smartest thing for the show. I always hope that if I have something that's I feel is a negative, that later down the road it can turn into a positive. So my hope is that in season 3, they prove me wrong and they come up with a really innovative way to keep telling this story. But I have to say, as we sit here at the end of season 2, I feel a little bit let down because I've consistently loved how this show has taken characters new and old to new places. And I feel like this is the first time where we have taken them backwards to somewhere that we've already been. There was another Mandalorian first, however, and that was an extended post-credit sequence. And I have to give them credit here because last week on Investor Day, Disney Investor Day, they announced approximately 347 new projects, and yet they allowed one of them to be a surprise for the end of this week's episode of The Mandalorian, and we get the name of a new Star Wars series, which is apparently coming a year from now in December 2021, The Book of Boba Fett, which it seems is going to be following what happens with Boba Fett on Tatooine taking over the Hutt crime syndicate. And I think that's the difference when you bring characters back, between putting them in a corner and allowing them to be in a familiar place or in a familiar situation, but still have the freedom to do what they want. I feel that way about Boba Fett. I hope that they're able to do things like that with Grogu. If they decide to make Luke, I hope he's not a regular on the show, and I know a lot of people are going to disagree, but whatever they decide to do, I hope they figure out an inventive way to do it with Grogu. I am looking forward to season 3. I wish I was more excited about this. I'm sure a lot of you wish that I was more excited about this, but I got to shoot straight with you and just say that I'm very skeptical. So those are my thoughts on the season finale of The Mandalorian. Let me know what you liked about it. Maybe if there were some things that you didn't like about it. I always love to hear what people think in the comments down below. And as always, if you want to see even more of what I'm up to, you can check me out on Patreon at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. And don't forget to check out my podcast, All My Movies. Next week, I'm super excited. We're wrapping up the holiday season by talking about the classic It's a Wonderful Life, and my guest will be one of my favorite critics, Mr. Leonard Maltin will be joining the podcast. So I would love for you to tune in and check that episode out. And I'd love for you to tune in and check out other stuff on the channel if you have not burned it in effigy. I appreciate you watching. I love that everybody can have different opinions. If you loved Luke Skywalker, you go with your Jedi self. I love it. I love that you loved it. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.